Hi, folks. Thanks for watching my monologue. As America starts to reopen, just remember that guns, etc., never closed. They still have over 10,200 square feet of ammo, firearms, and accessories, including safes, and they remain open for business. Stop by their huge store in Mesa or just click on gunsetcetera.com. And if you like my monologues, please subscribe to 960 The Patriots YouTube channel. Thanks. Welcome back and happy June 26th. We had a great event last night, Morality in the 21st Century with Dennis Prager and Wayne Grudem. If you missed it, it will be made available on a DVD. If you were there, I'd love to hear your thoughts. It was a great evening, and it was great seeing and speaking with those of you who came up to me. I always love that. A few thoughts I had on the way home from it. Let me start, if I may, with a concept from Deuteronomy. Every election, we are told, is the most important election of our lives. It's true now more than ever. I think we'd all agree on that. Not because we exaggerate, but because the left keep upping the stakes. Not that there's much to do about it, but I kind of regret that we spoke so much that way about elections in the past, saying that they were the most important. It's not exactly a crying of wolf. We were right about those elections too, but two things. One, remember the real story of the boy who cried wolf. At the end, there really was a wolf. And two, the stakes are much different now, by orders of magnitude. As I say, because the left has upped the stakes. They started with things like secularism, perhaps prayer in school was out, and then contraception was in, and then abortion and race preferences. They moved to equal rights amendments and climate change and appeasement of dictators. Now pause right there. Those are the previous movements of the left since about the 1960s until about yesterday or 4 years ago. Think about how far those movements moved our political, social, and cultural needles. An awful lot in retrospect, no? Let's repeat, because it's all really been done in only a generation and a half, not more. Secularism, prayer in school, contraception, abortion, race preferences, equal rights amendments, climate change, appeasement of dictators, all while also infusing themselves and suffusing themselves through our education system. It's an awful lot of convulsing in a generation and a half. But now today, with almost all those victories in hand, we move to the very destruction of the very founding and composition of America. George Washington, Abraham Lincoln, even our founding date. It's no longer 1776, as we were all taught. It's now 157 years earlier, 1619. Slavery, not freedom, they tell us, is our benchmark. Equality wasn't our founding principle, but rather racism was. So much so it's in our DNA, they say. Jefferson Davis wasn't the problem. I suppose because maybe his side lost. We'll come back to that. Lincoln and Grant, and of course Jefferson and Washington and Teddy Roosevelt are the problem. The very pillars of the very touchstones of America. Mount Rushmore, if you will. Let me pause a moment here to point out that I think the left has the wrong Roosevelt. It was his cousin, Franklin Delano, who put Americans in internment camps based solely on their race. Over 110,000 of them. Legalized racism is how Justice Murphy of the U.S. Supreme Court put Roosevelt's plan. Today we honor the dissent in the wartime case that upheld Franklin Roosevelt's imprisonment of over 110,000 Japanese Americans. It's known as Korematsu. It's still taught in law schools. And there was a dissent, just as there was a North and a Union that fought Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens and the Confederacy. As some of you know, I'm a huge fan of a Democratic appointment to the Supreme Court named Robert Jackson. He would later prosecute the Nazis at Nuremberg, taking a leave from the Supreme Court to do so. But he too dissented in the Japanese-American internment case, Korematsu. He wrote, quote, "If any fundamental assumption underlies our system, it is that guilt is personal and not inheritable. Even if all of one's antecedents had been convicted of treason, The Constitution forbids its penalties to be visited upon him, for it provides that no attainder of treason shall work corruption of blood or forfeiture, except during the life of the person attainted. Article 3, Section 3, Clause 2. But here is an attempt, he went on to say, to make an otherwise innocent act a crime, merely because this prisoner is the son of parents as to whom he had no choice, and belongs to a race from which there is no way to resign. Close quote. This is as clear a statement as I can find as to why attributing racism or any moral problem or crime to someone because of their race or ethnicity or any other thing not of their own doing is wrong. These are the words that were used to oppose Franklin Roosevelt's internment camps based on race. They are words that mean nothing to the left today because, you see, we are all guilty of racism today simply for not being black. I was going to say simply for being white, but we can't quite say that because I don't know where that leaves Jews and Asians who are never considered in BLM type or Antifa type history and legacy of racism or hate crime claims, and who are usually targets of BLM and Antifa movements, with the majority of other Americans, though Jewish and Asian Americans are smaller minorities than even African Americans combined. They are targets of affirmative action, Jews and Asians, and race preferences. Jews make up about 2% of the U.S. population, Asian Americans about 6%. Combined, they are still less than the African American population in America, which is 13%, but they're never considered for any of the racial grievance plans to fix racial problems in America. They are the targets of them. But my point is this, it's actually severalfold. Those who march and riot over American racism today have A, targeted the wrong Roosevelt, B, do not know what the opposition to racism in this country is or was, for it was and is the notion that guilt is personable and not inheritable. Any other understanding was previously known as prejudice. That's why it's so obviously wrong to judge people by color or anything other than their own individual actions and statements. And that should go for Americans today, too. Americans who never owned slaves, and really all of America today, which is 155 years past ending slavery in America. In other words, the root problem of racism, judging someone by their traits and immutable characteristics, is exactly what is being alleged against all non-black Americans today by the BLM and Antifa movements. Now, don't get me wrong, I well know of Jim Crow and the failures of Reconstruction. But I well know, too, the history of the civil rights movement in the 1950s and 1960s. It yielded the famous 1964 Civil Rights Act. Now, quick, name me the black senators who voted for it. There were none. And there were only 5 black members of the House of Representatives. So explain to me how a massively majority white American House of Representatives and U.S. Senate could approve of the Civil Rights Act if white Americans were endemically racist. Have we become more racist since the 1960s? It's a factual impossibility. The notion we see infusing the statute deconstruction movement in America is based on historic idiocy or illiteracy, or it's based on something else. Sheer want to destroy and take down America. That is why they target Washington and Jefferson, our first president and the author of the Declaration of Independence, our founding instrument. That is why they changed the date of our founding. That is why they go after Lincoln and Grant. No greater expositors of Washington and Jefferson than Lincoln and Grant. And so in an odd way, they've accepted and adopted the very philosophy of that which they tell us they are against. I'll say it again. There was a movement that said our founding was meant to embrace and perpetuate slavery, as opposed to, say, regrettably accept slavery and put it on the path of ultimate extinction. The movement that said our founding was meant to embrace and perpetuate slavery had no better articulator than the author of what we used to think of as the worst decision in Supreme Court history, the Dred Scott decision, and that articulator was Chief Justice Roger B. Taney. That movement was a movement that took up arms against America and proclaimed slavery not a negative evil, but a positive good, and claimed the founders meant it to be as well. That movement had a name. It was called the Confederate States of America, and it had 11 states. But there was another movement that said the founders did not think that way. And they cited not only the Declaration of Independence, but the Northwest Ordinance of 1787 and Article 1, Section 9 of the Constitution, which permitted the banning of the slave trade, which Congress did enact, and so many other things. That movement had a name too. It was called the Union. Lincoln, Grant, and it had 20 states that fought on the side of Lincoln and Grant and Union, and hundreds of thousands of lives given for that cause. That side, the bigger one, actually won. The BLM and Antifa act as if the Confederacy won, as if the 11 states were right and the 20 states were wrong, because they tell us America was based on and promoted slavery. That was the view of the 11, not the 20. Part of America did believe that, the losing side and the smaller side. Why is the losing and smaller side the narrative of America? Why isn't the narrative, well, the majority of states here didn't endorse slavery and went to war to end it? Why is that not the narrative? Why do the BLM and Antifa movements talk like Roger B. Taney and Jefferson Davis and Alexander Stephens as if the reasoning of Dred Scott was right? Why do they not cite the justices who dissented in Dred Scott, or Lincoln and Grant who worked against the view of Dred Scott and went to war against it? Because then their whole narrative blows up. But make no mistake, the BLM and Antifa movements and the 1619 movement not only have their history wrong, they're on the wrong side of history. They don't just have their history wrong, they're on the wrong side of history. Because I, for one, grew up thinking Lincoln was right, not Jefferson Davis. I, for one, grew up thinking Grant was a hero and had our founding right, not Nathan Bedford Forrest. But I give you the times. Their history is wrong, and they're on the wrong side of it, targeting all the wrong things and all the wrong people. So why did I say Deuteronomy up front? There's an interesting passage in Deuteronomy on wars of obligation. And I see this election as our first cultural war of obligation election. We don't need to and should not be, of course, in any way misunderstood to be saying we must pick up arms. I'm not for that at all. Ballots, not bullets, is how we settle our differences in America, Lincoln taught us. But we must gird ourselves, ready ourselves, and go into democratic battle, convincing our friends, relatives, fellow citizens, and everyone that we can. For as was once said long ago, by the man the BLM and Antifa forces are trying to take down physically and morally, if we do, we could nobly save, and if we don't, we will meanly lose this, our last best hope of Earth. I'm Seth Leibson. We'll be right back.